Hi, everybody. Welcome to Wisconsin Icons. It's good, as always, to have you with me. My name is Bob Dolan. My title sponsor is Pasternak and Zergabel, injury attorneys, award-winning injury attorneys based in Brookfield, Wisconsin. Their website is www.injurywisconsin.com. Remember a previous episode when we featured the great life and great Baseball Hall of Fame career of Hank Aaron. And at the time, we said he was an icon of icons. And I think today's featured icon is in the same class. Les Paul, born in Waukesha, and in his heyday, he was as big as they get in the musical industry. And not only on stage and on records, but also as an innovator. He thought of things and created things and invented things that are still in use today. And he's been described as a musical genius by even 50 years later. Les Paul, when he passed, the biggest names in music, Paul McCartney, Mick Jagger, others pointed at Les Paul and said, I learned from that guy. That guy influenced me. So Les Paul is my icon today. And to hear more about Les Paul, my guest is Sue Baker. Sue is the program director at the Les Paul Foundation. Sue, good morning. Welcome to Wisconsin Icons.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
I greatly look forward to our discussion about Les Paul for a couple of reasons. I, like most people in Wisconsin, I think don't know enough about Les Paul, who's one of the giants of our state. But secondly, this is right up my alley because I've been accused by friends and family members that I was born about 2 generations too late musically, because I grew up, my dad would always have Sinatra, Nat King Cole, the Mills Brothers, always. So to this day, that's still my choice of music would be, and Les Paul fits right in there. So we're kind of both singing the same song here. The best part about having you on, Sue, 2 reasons. First, you know everything there is pretty much about Les Paul, and secondly, you knew him. You knew the man himself. How did that come about?
Well, at the time, I was the executive director of the Waukesha County Historical Society and Museum, and I wanted to put up an exhibit on the most famous person who ever lived in Waukesha County. So I asked 6 leaders in the community. I asked them that question. I got the same answer. So a long story short, I got to meet Les Paul. I called him on the phone and we had great chats. And then he said, I want you to come out to the house, which was in Mahwah, New Jersey. And I went out there, got to his house, sat for a moment, kind of collected my thoughts, got out, knocked on the door swings open and Les says, Sue, you're here, come on in. And that was kind of our relationship. We really enjoyed each other. I think he liked the fact that I had a lot of curiosity like he did. So I'd ask him tons of questions. And with Les, you ask him one question and he would tell you one fabulous story after another.
Let's bullet point his career, because if we dissected it, we'd be here for a week. But I mentioned in the introduction to you, Sue, that he really excelled in 4 different areas. At a solo artist, a studio musician, where he literally performed with the biggest names in the industry. And then, of course, his duo with Mary Ford, and then especially as an innovator. So let's talk first about his on stage, his career musically. When were his peak years, or his peak decades in his case?
The short answer, 1950s, but let me take you back a bit.
Yeah.
When he was a little kid, I mean, we're talking preschool, living in Waukesha, his mom recognized that Les had talent. And Les told me that he was like 3 or 4 years old. And Les was always physically a small guy. But he said, my mom would dress me up and she would call like the Kiwanis and the Rotary and all those other fraternal organizations and say, you need to hear my son sing. And Les said, he said, I was so tiny that they would have to pick me up, put me on a table. And he said, I would stand up there and I would sing and I'd dance and I'd tell funny stories. So this is when he was in preschool. So talk about born to do something.
Yeah.
But I mean, it would, like you said, we could be here for weeks. So I'll try to narrow it down. He was performing in Waukesha And then at 17 years old, and this was the height of the Depression when most people weren't working, he got offered a steady job of being on the radio in St. Louis, Missouri. And after that, it was Springfield, Missouri. And then he and his friend, Sonny Joe Wolverton, the two of them were a duo, got a job in Chicago. And this would have been in 1930. It was during the World's Fair. So they were playing on the radio and they're playing at the World's Fair. Then that's where he got his name, by the way. Les Paul was in Chicago because he had been playing country music as Rhubarb Red, but that name would not fly for jazz.
Yeah.
So he was actually had a dual career in Chicago.
The name Les Paul came from where?
Nobody seems to know.
Nobody knows, really.
Yeah, but so he was doing jazz at night as Les Paul and doing country as Rhubarb Red. And he said, I was making lots of money. He was making $1,000 a week doing country music during the Great Depression.
Yeah.
And he said, I was making $5 a week doing jazz, but that's what he liked.
So you mentioned earlier, Sue, that his peak was probably the 50s, the decade of the 50s. What was happening in the 50s with his career?
In the 50s, that's when he was married to Mary Ford, and they were doing all their gold records.
She was the vocalist. Did he ever sing with her?
Excuse me. Not that I can think of. Okay. He really stuck with the guitar.
So he was guitar, she was vocalist, and they were huge. That duo was huge, as big as they get in that time.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, I did mention earlier that this is kind of my musical taste. I'm a big Bing Crosby guy, and I'm a big Nat King Cole. I think they've got two of the great voices of all time, Bing and Nat King Cole. And I can't, when I'm 5, I'm listening to my dad singing "Kiss Me Once and Kiss Me Twice and Kiss Me Once Again." And in 1945, that was the #1 song in the country, Bing Crosby. Mm-hmm. Little did I know that the guy beside him was Les Paul.
Right.
So Les kind of, you mentioned earlier that he had zero ego. He was very content and very comfortable kind of taking a secondary role to Mary Ford and also to the biggest names in the industry, right? He was fine doing his thing.
Yes, he loved sound. Everything was about how things sounded. Mm-hmm. He did like to be on stage and front and center. There's no two ways about that.
What about Les Paul, now the innovator? And in my opinion, you look at his career and he did great things on stage, but the things he did in his study are back at home when his mind is always racing about how can I do things differently? How can I do things better? How can I do things that have literally never been thought of before? And I think the most glaring example might be the multi-layer tracking, which is still, today that's common. Everybody does it. Mm-hmm. Les Paul thought of it. Les Paul came up with it and he got it to work. What's that story all about? Tell us about his persistence and the fact that he just knew he was on to something.
Well, the Sound on Sound started, again, I'm taking you back to Waukesha. Okay. His mom had a player piano, and as a kid, that was her prized possession, Evelyn's prized possession. She had told Les, do not take apart my piano. But what Les did was, it was a player piano. So he took the beginning and the end of the roll where it's blank, and he added holes. And he said, if I didn't like how it sounded, I put tape over it. And when I ran out of tape, I put Band-Aids over it. But that was the beginning of Sound on Sound, was his experimentation back when, and he probably would have been about between 10 and 12 years old when he did this. And he loved how that sounded. And then the Sound on Sound actually happened when he was living in Hollywood. And this would have been after he had become really good friends with Bing Crosby. He thought about it, and what he came up with is adding another head to this great big tape recorder. And that is the most seminal thing that Les did in his career, because that was sound on sound, and that's where he could record Mary singing and then play it back through this extra head and put another layer on top. And they kept doing that, and that's when it sounded like there were 12 Mary Fords and 12 Les Pauls on one record.
It's remarkable. I mean, today it's just kind of, oh yeah, that's what people do. We don't even think of a second thing about it. But can you imagine back then coming, and I can imagine Les Paul running around the industry saying, guess what I got? And everybody's looking at him saying, this can't work. You're crazy. And then here we are 60 years later, and it worked.
Well, yes. And crazy is exactly what Gibson said to Les when he brought in his solid body electric guitar.
Yeah.
Now you have to keep in mind what it looked like, because it didn't look like the Gibson Les Paul solid body electric guitar we see today. Rather, it was a 4x4 piece of wood with an Epiphone neck on it. And it was, had the 6 strings, and Les played it, and Les loved how it sounded. And he took it to Gibson and said, you guys got to do solid body electric guitars.
One of my favorite quotes about Les Paul came from Maxine Andrews of the famous Andrews Sisters. Mm-hmm. And apparently Les was working with the Andrews Sisters for a while. And Maxine Andrews says, when you work with Les Paul, it was almost like having a fourth voice. Mm-hmm. Les Paul didn't sing with the Andrews Sisters. He played guitar, but she said it was like having a fourth voice where he could literally make his guitar, this astounds me, he could make his guitar harmonize with the Andrews Sisters. Now, I love listening to music. I know nothing about playing music. That blows my mind.
Yeah. I've heard, if people see the movie, I've got a copy here, Les Paul Chasing Sound, you'll hear that in there's a quote that when Les played with Mary, he knew when to put the, if you will, spotlight on the guitar and when to back off and let her sing.
Sure.
So he really did that.
Yeah. When he passed, some of the giants of the industry paid tribute to him. And I think that's when most people of my generation and younger, that's when we realized Les Paul of Waukesha, Wisconsin was as big as they get in music, because you had guys like Paul McCartney and Mick Jagger and scores of others saying, I learned from that guy. And that, mm-hmm. I think that for a lot of us, that's when it hit home.
Yeah, that's very true.
Is there a Les Paul museum? Or I know you work for the foundation. Tell me about the foundation, what the mission is, and is there a place where we can go see some of his early artifacts?
Oh, yes. Les established his foundation in 1995, and he wanted to, the mission of the foundation is to inspire innovative and creative thinking by sharing the legacy of Les Paul through support of music education, recording, innovation, and medical research related to tinnitus, ringing in the ears. Les wanted to share his resources especially with kids from challenging situations, kids who are economically, socially, physically challenged, and that's primarily what we do. People in Wisconsin have the best access to Les Paul's artifacts because the 2 best Les Paul exhibits are at Discovery World in Milwaukee and the Waukesha County Historical Society and Museum on Main Street in Waukesha.
Very good.
They both are dynamic exhibits. And they look at Les, people might say, well, why I would go to one, why would it go the other? Because they look at Les a little differently. Discovery World's a science museum, so they look at the science of sound. And Waukesha County Historical Society is a history museum, so you get a better sense of who Les the man was, and you get you get a better look at who Mary was also, because
Yeah.
that relationship is showed in the Waukesha County Historical Society Museum. There's also exhibits at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Okay.
There's a really fun exhibit in New Orleans at the Music Village. And I'll just tell people, just look on the internet for the Music Village in New Orleans, and you can learn more about that. But lots of fun things.
Well, Sue, you've been a delight. And as I said earlier, you and I could talk for a week about this stuff, but I think you filled us in really well on the legend and the icon that was Les Paul. And I really appreciate your visit today.
Sure. You're welcome. My pleasure.
You take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.